Well, the day is here where the game director of Overwatch 2, Aaron Keller, has written up a 3,000-word blog addressing 5v5 or 6v6 versions of the game. Now, if you stumbled on this video as a casual Overwatch fan and you've not been following Overwatch news on social media, hi, welcome. Let me summarize things for you very quickly. Overwatch 1 was a 6v6 game for 6 years, and then they swapped to Overwatch 2 as a 5v5 game for the last year and a half. And a portion of the active player base has been very vocal about wanting to bring the game back to 6v6 because now that we played 5v5 for a little while, it poses some problems that going back to 6v6 will solve. The noise and rumbling has gotten quite loud, to be honest with you, with both sides of the fan base going after each other like a piece of chicken on the floor beside a hungry dog. I've obviously played both games a lot. I've been doing content for this game for many years now, thousands of hours in 6v6, probably over 1,000 now in 5v5. I'm honestly quite neutral on this. I don't really feel strongly about one or the other because it's always going to be about trading one problem for another. But I digress. Let's dive into this article. Sit back and enjoy the sound of my voice. Director's Take, an intro to our perspectives on 5v5 and 6v6 by Aaron Keller. Hey everyone. There's been a lot of talk about 6v6 lately, and it's only intensified in recent weeks since we posted our latest Director's Take and made a Twitter post with a promise to talk about it in the future. Well, now is the future, and this is that next piece. So let's get into it. Wait, let's not get into it quite yet. This is a pretty complex and nuanced topic, and it gets to the beating heart of what makes this game tick. Our players have different opinions and preferences about the ideal number of players in an Overwatch match, and so does our team. We're a microcosm of the broader community and actually discuss this internally. I'm hoping that this piece will serve as an introduction to our own discussions and a jumping off point to engage with all of you. I'd also like to set a few expectations and ground rules. First, it's pretty long. Creators are going to lose their voices reading this one aloud. No, I'm not. If you'd like a TLDR, the what's next sections should suffice. Yeah, I'm not skipping that, Aaron. I'm reading the whole thing. Secondly, I'm not here to tell you what you ought to like or what's even empirically better. This is a game, and your preference for fun is relative to your own tastes, abilities, and experiences. Lastly, there are years of decisions that affect such a fundamental piece of Overwatch. Some of you might be intimately aware of these, while others may not. So before diving into this, I'd like to set the stage and give some context on some of the larger changes to the game that ultimately culminated in the 5v5 format we have today. There have been 3 large format changes to Overwatch, and the first happened shortly after the game launched. He's referencing 2016 May. This was hero limits. Before this, there could be any number of a particular hero on one team. You could have 6 Genjis or 6 Reinhardts, and if memory serves me right, the winner of Team 4's first internal tournament was 1 Winston and 5 Zenyatas. We called it the Quinston comp. Zenyatta orbs stacked with each other at the time because there's no cap to healing at the time, and it was glorious and terrifying. During early development, it was necessary to have duplicate heroes per team. Our first core combat milestone only had 4 heroes. As the roster grew, this was no longer necessary, and it introduced issues. Overwatch heroes have very distinct kits with impactful abilities, and stacking abilities could be fun, but it posed challenges to balancing many of those abilities in-game. People reference double barrier, but back then, you could have 6. Now imagine cycling 6 immortality fields. The number of team compositions and strategies available was huge. The variety was great, but we didn't feel like we could ever truly balance the game without severely watering down our heroes, so we made the choice to impose a limit of 1 of each hero per team. This essentially solved the issue of ability stacking, but it did have a few side effects. It traded some of the creativity in putting together team comps for a more consistent and balanced experience. It also took away some choice from players. If someone wanted to play Tracer, but you were already Tracer, I see what you did there, they would be unable to. A theme of this and future decisions was limiting match variety as well as player freedom and creativity in order to create a more balanced, consistent, and competitive experience for players. Remember this point because we'll touch on it a few more times in this piece. I think that the hero limit rule was a great decision and we would not make it again. The other 2 large format changes have had a lot of positive benefits but are not as clear cut. The second large change to the game's format was the move from open queue to role queue, which limited team compositions to 2 heroes from each role. Before role queue, there was no enforced 2-2-2 team composition, and players had the freedom to select any role they liked once they loaded into a match. This was August 2019, by the way, so 3 years later. With open queue, teams did have a lot of freedom of choice about what heroes and team compositions to play, but there were quite a few problems that role queue intended to address. Prior to implementing role queue, there was a stark imbalance in the number of people playing each role within each match. Damage was by far and is still today the most popular role, and tank was by far the least popular. In fact, seeing matches with 5 or even 6 damage players on each team was not uncommon. This role imbalance frequently led to wildly imbalanced matches between teams. The game played better when heroes from all 3 roles were selected. The disparity caused social issues as players would try to pressure others into playing tank or support roles even if they didn't want to. It made balancing heroes more difficult since we couldn't balance around a certain role ratio for each team, and it even made introducing new heroes more difficult since any new hero kit had to take into consideration hundreds of different team compositions and abilities that could overlap with it. The move to a role queue format was aimed to mitigate these challenges. Moving to role queue solved many of these problems and added some additional benefits to the game as well. With role queue in place, matchmaking is now based on skill within a given role and not just a skill overall. Some people have wildly different skill ratings per role, so the ability to matchmake around set roles provides a big measurable boost to match quality. Role queue also solidified the identity of each role, and the fantasy of doing that role's job became clearer. However, the switch to role queue did have some downsides, the largest of which was much longer queue times. Prior to role queue, the matchmaker just needed to find 12 players of similar skill levels in order to put matches together. After role queue, it needed to find 4 players of each role to make a match. The total number of players queuing has no effect on this. It's almost solely governed by the ratio of people queuing for the least popular role. Given the game's lower relative ratio of players queuing for tank compared to damage and support roles, queue times went way up. We'll go into details on this later. The team tried to address this imbalance in various ways. We introduced a priority pass system, oh god, I remember these tickets, that gave people who played low demand roles like tank a shorter queue when they switched to damage role. This had a positive effect for several weeks, but its influence quickly faded. We also introduced some systems to reward players for playing tank, eventually giving them like a loot box or a bunch of XP for queuing for that role. None of these were able to put a dent into the demand for playing DPS. Damage queue times drifted a bit lower over time, but this was due to the introduction of open queue competitive and the permanent loss of damage players unwilling to wait that long for a match. These were additional drawbacks with role queue. I mentioned earlier that many of our decisions made improvements to the game at the cost of match variety and player freedom. Team compositions were now locked to 2-2-2. This was another step to a more consistent experience within Overwatch, but sometimes the consistency can start to feel samey. There were some pretty exciting metas in the pre-role queue world, and swapping to a hero of a different role mid-match was often a much bigger change and more exciting than swapping to one of the same role. Like hero limits, role queue took away a part of the freedom in selecting heroes that served as the base of Overwatch, but I often wonder if the success of it is as cut and dry as that of hero limits. Could there have been an in-between version that softens the original problems without completely solving them, and also isn't quite as restrictive as our current role queue system? A bit more on that later. Alright, the third major format change. So this is October 2022. These challenges, as well as longer queue times, led us to the third and most recent major format change of the game, the shift from 6v6 to 5v5. This is almost a blog within a blog, but we're going to cover 3 things. A, why we switched to 5v5. B, the queue times after the switch to 5v5. And C, what the team thinks of 6v6 internally. So why did we switch to 5v5? There were many reasons behind the transition to 5v5. When we launched Overwatch 2, we talked about the greater individual agency that players could have in 5v5. Overwatch is a team sport, and it requires players to rely on each other to be successful. This was even more the case previously, and the game could be frustrating if your team was out of sync. Many times, fights in 6v6 couldn't resolve until the ultimate abilities came online. correct that, until ultimate combos could be executed to break through 2 tanks worth of mitigation, supported by high, uncontested healing output. The world of 6v6 could have really high highs, but really low lows. One of the design goals of 5v5 was to raise that floor, even though it was at the expense of some of those high moments. Just like to interject, I think some of the high moments of some of my favorite is like obviously Rein Zarya, Winston Zarya, and me as an Ana player. I love playing Winston Zarya, nanoing them, sleeping the Genji that jumped me. Very high highs, but like being realistic, he's not wrong. There's a lot of low lows as well. Overwatch 2 has also a greater emphasis on FPS gameplay. There's actually less damage mitigation and CC, and players get to shoot at enemies more. Crowd control could take players out of the game for extended periods of time, especially when they were chained back to back. A 5-second Sombra hack, oh my god, it used to be 5 seconds, I can't believe this, may freeze on her primary fire, Brig Bash, Ana Sleep, Orisa Halt, Sigma Rock could all happen consecutively to one player. Typically, a tank who could often survive this onslaught, at least in-game, their real-life mental health was another story. Damage heroes often complained that their role was the least impactful relative to the strength of the super powerful tank synergies, support heroes undoing their playmaking. The emphasis on ability cooldown management, ult tracking, shooting barriers instead of players, and not big enough timing windows to just shoot enemies and get eliminations were all factors that contributed to this feeling. Support heroes also had to focus almost exclusively on healing since there were bigger team health pools and more incoming damage on the field with the additional tank player. In 5v5, they have more agency to add some damage or duel other players. Tank synergy wasn't always fun. It slowed the game down and stabilized it, but sometimes it absolutely ground it to a halt. People point to the double shield meta as an example of this, but it wasn't just about double shields though. The ability to stack a very defensive heavy lineup, especially in game modes that required a team to push through a small choke, caused a lot of matches to feel like there was no progress at all. The game is faster now and it doesn't typically stall out. It feels like there is more room to move around a map without the need to earn every inch of it. In 5v5, fights are often less focused on moving around in a death ball formation, and there is more room to take angles, flank, and duel other players, which brings in more of that FPS gameplay. While 6v6 can have high moments, it's also hard to follow. Tracking 9 other players is easier than tracking 11 players. There are fewer visual effects on screen, especially during big team fights. Overwatch is a pretty demanding game, and moving to 5v5 made it a bit more cognitively manageable. Lastly, one of the biggest benefits of 5v5 was dramatically reduced queue times. Let's explore that first. Oh, we have graphs. Let's go. The chart below shows ranked play queue times per role after the introduction of role queue to Overwatch in 2019, compared to the queue times per role in Overwatch 2's 5v5 role queue format. As you can see, the shift to 5v5 role queue dramatically reduced queue times for players in all roles, and most notably the damage role, which is the most popular role. If you're listening to this and not actually looking at the screen on the YouTube video right now, you should tab back in, or I'll read it out to you right now. The graph shows the DPS average queue time in Overwatch's 6v6 format after 2019, after role queue, was 7.6 minutes. So 7 minutes, a little over 7.5 minutes. For an average DPS queue. When they swapped to Overwatch 2, this is Overwatch 2 5v5 lifetime. It's 2.9 minutes. So 7.6 minutes for DPS players in Overwatch 1, 2.9 for damage players in Overwatch 2. That is a very significant increase. In Overwatch 1, it was 2.8 minutes for support. In Overwatch 2, it's 1.4 minutes for support. So that's half the time it takes to queue for support. Tanks would get 1.8 minute queue times in Overwatch 1 and 1.3 minute queue times in Overwatch 2. I mean, this checks out with what I remember anecdotally as well. Damage had the longest queue times. Tank, I mean, 1.8 average time to find 2 tanks to fill out makes sense because it was the most demanded role. If you queued tank, you'd find a game instantly because there wasn't enough of you guys. Back to Aaron. Aaron says, the biggest factor driving the difference between Overwatch and Overwatch 2 queue times is the ratio of players queuing for each role. We hear players speculate that long queue times are a result of not enough players playing Overwatch. That isn't the case, but instead that relative to the other roles, players generally queue tank less, leading to longer wait times for all while we wait for a tank to free up to find a proper match. So in practice, the actual ratio of players queuing for tank damage supports is much closer to the current 1-2-2 format than the previous 2-2-2 format. As a result, the 5v5 role queue format better mirrors actual player interest in each role, and making the switch resulted in shorter queue times. The sharp drop-off in queue times in October of 2022 is when Overwatch 2, along with 5v5, shipped. The queue times of all heroes dropped and are now much shorter than they were in the 6v6 world. This is almost all because the game required one less tank in a match. If you look at the current queue times, you can see that there is still a lack of tanks compared to our other roles. Just flipping the switch and returning to 6v6 would likely cause a return to previous queue times or worse. Regardless of the amount of players in-game, queue times are always reflective of how many people are queued per role. In other words, the main driver of increased queue times is the ratio of players queued in each role. Since there are less players queuing as tanks, because we got rid of one of course, queues would likely go back to the way they were. Aaron's saying this is independent of the active player base. It's always the ratio that matters. Now Aaron moves on to their internal thoughts on 6v6. The game started its life with 6 players on each team. I discussed why we moved away from 6v6, but that doesn't mean it's without any merit. There were moments in madness that could happen with 12 players in a match that just don't quite coalesce when there are 10 players. It's almost too much to keep track of. Correction, it was too much to keep track of at times, but that was part of the charm. There are big moments in Overwatch 2, but they don't have that same chaotic, over-the-top feeling to them. I can agree with that. Part of the chaos allowed players to feel less pressure in a match. There was an extra player to take up a bit of the slack for someone that was performing poorly, and since that player was a tank, they had quite a bit of impact. There were a lot more hit points and defensive capabilities to burn through, which had a stabilizing effect on gameplay. Teams would fold a bit slower than they do now. We went over some of the issues of tank synergy earlier, but having 2 of them allowed one to focus on protecting their backline while the other held ground or pushed into the enemy. The tank role had a lot of depth in understanding how to work with the other tank on the team. This part of the mastery curve took a long time to learn, and for the small group of people devoted to it, that was part of its allure. We mentioned the difficulty in balancing tanks for 6v6 earlier, but the past year and a half has shown us that there are obviously issues with balancing tanks for 5v5 as well. For much of Overwatch 2, tanks have been fairly balanced, but when one of them becomes a powerful outlier, like Mauga, that can be felt strongly in the world of one tank. So what's next? Aaron says, okay, that was a lot of setup. I think I put more effort into this than any essay I wrote in college. So where do we go from here? At the end of the day, we want to make the game that players want to play. Because of the challenges mentioned previously, we are focused on making 5v5 the best experience that it can be. However, because we operate as a service to our players, a live service game, we always remain open-minded to reevaluating our decisions based on your actions and feedback to give you the best game experience we can. Rather than introduce a disruptive, permanent change to the game, we prefer to explore the space further and make changes based on that exploration. With that said, we're looking at running a series of events to try out different core team composition formats in Overwatch 2. The community has just once, or maybe twice, suggested a test. So why not put various forms of 6v6 back in the game in order to gauge the results? We agree, and based on your feedback, we're exploring on how we can test different forms of 6v6 in the game to gauge results. This is actually taking some time, however, but for reasons that may not be readily apparent. The first and honestly largest reason is the need to do this in a way that allows the game to have optimized technical performance. I'm referring to frame rate and memory constraints with 12 players in a match. There have been quite a few upgrades and additions to Overwatch 2 that have impacted on the performance of the game. These range from new features like allied outlines and enabling healer vision by default, and the addition of more technically demanding hero kits, as well as visual upgrades to the UI, heroes, and maps. In a 6v6 setting, these upgrades can have significant impacts for our players, causing the game to underperform on older systems. Overwatch is a fast-paced game, and maintaining a game that runs smoothly across all of our platforms is important for the player's experience. While a limited time test could arrive sooner, the team is still investigating exactly how long it would take to permanently increase performance across the game. This would be a large effort that would likely take at least several seasons to accomplish. Now, I'm no, IT or developer on network optimizations, but he has a point. I've tried playing Nintendo Switch Overwatch while I was taking a shit, and yeah, that thing runs pretty ass. And I can't even imagine having an extra player with the upgraded Overwatch 2 version with all the updated stuff. Probably not good, and it's important for them as a company to, reach the broader community, right? You may be a PC player and be like, who cares? But this is actually an important thing. And one thing I'll praise Blizzard for is actually their optimization of Overwatch. It actually runs pretty butter smooth and looks great, to be honest with you. I played Marvel Rivals yesterday, and I'm dipping down to like 60, 70 FPS on an RTX 4090. I mean, it's early beta for that game, and it maybe haven't optimized it yet, but I'm just giving credit where credit's due there. Aaron now says, another issue, and one that still gives me anxiety about opening this Pandora's box, is what to do with queue times if enough players prefer 6v6 to keep some form of it around. The team was not able to solve this issue previously, so while we have some ideas now, there's no guarantee that they will work. Is there a world where people are willing to live with long queue times to play this format? Maybe, but that's a pretty risky move to make. We also have tens of millions of new players that have only played 5v5. We want to be openly mindful to not frustrate those who actually like the game as it is today. The outcome of these tests would give us a lot of valuable information to consider moving forward. We'd run the test for a few weeks and gauge interest from the community, and then we'd measure the impact it had on the other experiences like in Overwatch 2, like 5v5, arcade, etc. We take the lessons from this playtest to see what we can learn about the mode within the current game ecosystem and for the future of Overwatch. We would reflect carefully on the learnings from whatever test we run and explore how to best give players what's being asked for, whether that's a world of 5v5, 6v6, or even both is for the future us to figure out. I mean, I agree. I'm a longtime RuneScape player. I played since 2002. And when they swapped to RS3, I played it for a bit, but I didn't enjoy it, and I prefer the old version of the game, kind of like the 6v6 and 5v5 comparison. And when they released Old School, I really liked it, but I actually got bored, and I was like, this feels the same. And then I went back to RuneScape 3 for a bit, but then over time, they iterated on Old School a lot, and now that's my main game. I play in Iron Man, by the way. Shout out to all the Old School RuneScape players. Let's go. Aaron now says, I'm going to jump on a soapbox for a moment. When you look at the changes to Overwatch since its inception, it's clear that many of those have reduced some of the variety within an Overwatch match. We get feedback from some players that Overwatch can feel the same from game to game. While much of this gets attributed to 5v5, we feel that there is more at play here. Besides running experiments with 6v6, we'd like to run some that re-examine the ways we tried solving previous problems, specifically with the goal of bringing some of the freedom back to an Overwatch match without the severity of issues that accompanied it. For instance, we think there could be other ways of putting a team together that aren't quite as rigid as a set composition, but not as loose as an open queue. We'll be running at least one quick play hacked based on this idea in Season 13. There are some gotchas to this direction, but after reading 400 pages of this blog, I hope you're all able to see that there are trade-offs to many of the decisions that go into this game, and into any game, really. I think what Aaron is alluding to here for their idea for different compositions is maybe a 1-3-2 format as a quick play hack. Go back to 6v6, but experiment with one tank. All right, to wrap it up for now, the end of the blog. Aaron says, your feedback has driven both our inspiration and commitment to testing new ideas in-game. We want to be super thoughtful about how we implement new ideas into the live game because there are millions of players who jump into Overwatch each season, and we want anything we put in the game to benefit the community as a whole. Ultimately, the Overwatch team wants to continue building the game that you want to play season after season. This blog, or thesis rather, is just the start of this conversation. This is not the last time we're going to be getting into 5v5 or 6v6, and we can't wait to share more about our plans in the future. In closing, we appreciate you so much. We love seeing your passion and dedication to the game, Team 4, and the Overwatch community. The team hears you, we see you, and we're incredibly thankful to be on this ride with all of you. Can't wait to share more in the upcoming months, and let's make a great game together. So in short, they gave us logical reasons on their format change, right? I can't fault them there. They gave us logical reasons why they went out of, the no limits, why you can't have one Winston, 5 Zens, and then I thought that's good, like having one hero per team. And then they went to role queue. That was good for the game. 2-2-2 was way better for me personally. Yes, it introduced new. Remember what I said earlier about introducing trading problems one for another? it solved the annoying, like, no tank, 5 DPS, 1 support, and I'm the 1 support. Like, if I ever wanted to, like, play DPS for a day in ranked, I couldn't, because, like, I would kind of just default to playing support. Or sometimes there'd be 3 support mains on my team, and I had to play tank when I didn't want to play tank in, like, a 4,500 game, where I knew my individual skill on that role was not as good. You know, role queue solved a lot of problems for me, and I actually enjoyed the first 2 changes. 5v5, I'm kind of neutral on, like I said at the beginning. I can actually go both ways there. I think Aaron was pretty transparent here on and the team on why they're doing that, and at least they're doing something about it here, where they're actually going to give players a format to play. So if you really love 6v6, jump back in the game, play it, sacrifice the queue times, and you know, see if you enjoy the format. Hopefully they balance it correctly, right? I can't imagine playing Zarya plus Mauga and bubbling the Mauga in every time. That's gonna be interesting to tweak, but it could spawn like a whole separate entity where you can play both versions of the game and enjoy both. Like I mentioned with my RuneScape example, I played both. I played old school when they reintroduced it in 2013. I played RuneScape 3, sometimes backed into old school a little bit, but then once they created the Iron Man mode for old school RuneScape, I basically just played that game. But they did kind of split the community into 2 with 2 separate dev teams. I don't even think it's a bad idea if there is enough of a divide and there's enough people that love both versions of the game. I just hope they don't separate the clients, but enough people play the game by volume that it isn't too much of an issue. But then again, we bring it back to what Aaron said. It's always the ratio of tank players, not so much the volume of players queuing in, because you always have to wait for one to free up. I'm not like a statistical genius, so I'm not really sure how much merit that holds, but I can see where he's coming from. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Thanks for listening to me yap, and I guess listening to what Aaron had to say. Leave it in the comments on what you guys think. What do you prefer? What do you hope for the game in the future? Thanks.